Hello and a very warm welcome to Bharata First. You're watching Frank Talk with me, Frank Rausan Pereira. Since you're here, please like the video, subscribe, hit the bell icon and share the video as well. Do subscribe to our newsletter to get some incisive content. The Bharata First team runs several quizzes. Participate in them. If you like our content, please contribute to keep it alive. Let me also take this opportunity to inform you about Bharata First Knowledge Center, an initiative that will help each one of you in your competitive exams and transform the way you learn. Go to kc.bharatafirst.com for more details and register now. Experience a whole new way of gaining knowledge. All this information, along with some must-see recommendations, are in the description of the video. Please go through it. Well, by public demand, he is back. It is a pleasure to welcome on Frank Talk once again Sai Deepak. The inaugural Frank Talk had him, and here he is again coming to Frank Talk, and he is, of course, not here as an advocate of the Supreme Court. He's a good one at that, but that's not what he's going to be doing today. He's here because he has another feather in his cap, that of an author. So today I welcome Sai Deepak, the author, on Frank Talk.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you so much for having me. And it's a pleasure to interact with your listeners and viewers. And I'd love to share my thoughts with them. And I'd love to answer the questions.
Absolutely. So first, let's look at, firstly, thank you for this. It's wonderful. And I'm one of those lucky ones who has a signed copy. I'm not going to reveal the message or read out the message, but thank you for giving me a signed copy. And like one of those good readers, I went and bought my own copy as well. So I would urge everyone else to go out there and buy a copy of this book. It's fantastic. I must confess, I haven't read it, but I intend to read it soon. And I urge all of you all to go out there and read this as well. So congratulations first and foremost, Sai, for this. It's wonderful.
Thank you.
And it's really great to have this in my hand. So let's start with what prompted you to write this book.
So, as you're aware, I was associated with the Sabarimala matter in 2018. What most people were not aware was that apart from the fact that I was representing women who supported the traditions of the temple, I had a lot of female lawyers, in fact, Malayali Christian lawyers, supporting me in this particular case, because they were aware of the practice of the temple. Because a lot of these people had actually given their houses on rent to the Swamis who actually observe the Diksha, so to speak. So they were very clearly aware of the practice, the sentiment, and the nature of the tradition of the particular temple. So among the things that I was subjected to was a bit of criticism of, let's say, patriarchy, being traditional, orthodox, anti-modern, irrational, anti-rational, so on and so forth. My typical tendency is to try and understand the source of the criticism as opposed to being affected by it. So the first question is, okay, is there some basis to it? I was actually interested by the choice of language to the extent that traditional was being heard as some kind of a pejorative. To say that if you're a traditional person, then effectively you're out of touch with reality, you're out of sync with modernity. And I was even called anti-modern. So I latched on to these words, traditional and modern. And I wanted to understand, when did they start acquiring these kind of positive and negative hues, so to speak? And that got me reading a lot more. And I was reading and giving a few lectures. There's this brilliant Indian-American scholar and educator. I can't call her an Indian-American because she's technically an American citizen, but an American of Indian origin, Dr. Indu Vishwanathan, whose area of competence, or at least one of her areas of interests, is decolonial scholarship. So she had reached out to me telling me that she found my arguments falling under the basket of decoloniality in action. So I asked her, what does this mean? So she basically said that as, let's say, descendants of a colonized society, so to speak, there is a certain layer of colonial consciousness that all of us are buried under. And therefore, when we try to rediscover our roots and when we try to rediscover our past, what we are doing is to engage in decolonial thought, which is to try and decolonize the mind itself. So she pushed me in this particular direction, was kind enough to share the literature extensively, had a lot of discussions. And then I decided to explore the relationship between the Indic civilization and the constitution applying the framework of decoloniality, which is to say whether the Indian constitution suffers from some degree of coloniality or colonial consciousness. And is that the reason that Indian traditions and Indic institutions are constantly litigants before the Supreme Court or High Courts, trying to prove the validity of their practices, trying to establish their legitimacy? So that's one of the reasons that I decided to explore this. And if you remember, around May last year is when I started a column called Indic Views in the Daily Guardian. So I used that as a testing ground to effectively understand whether the audience would be receptive to these points of view. So once these articles were published, the interesting aspect was I got positive feedback across the spectrum, regardless of people's individual ideological positions. So it could be the left, right, center, whatever it is. People reached out and said, I think it's important to have these conversations. So why don't you convert this in the form of a book? Was a suggestion that came from them as well. Now, writing a book is like preparing for a marathon. And if you've been only preparing for a 100-meter sprint or a dash, you'll have to change the way you train for you to be able to run a marathon. So I decided to increase the number of words and started writing 3,000 to 4,000 word pieces, or at least 3,000 word pieces. And when I realized that I had both the ammunition needed as well as the stamina for it, I decided to write. And my biggest regret was that I hadn't started writing as soon as the lockdown was announced. I started writing only in October. So I really was beating myself up that I wasted my time from March, April until October when I actually started writing. But fortunately, I used that period to read up a lot and familiarize myself with the literature, because I don't have training in the humanities outside of the law. So I had to read a lot about modernism, postmodernism, what is post-colonialism, how are each of these schools of thought different from each other. I started on 12th of October. I finished on 21st of April, which is Sri Ramanavami. And then I spent about 2 months effectively editing the book. And I had a fantastic research and editing team. And by the grace of gods, I think finally it came out. So far, I can say that the reception has been decent, heartwarming and encouraging. At the very least, I can be happy about the fact that the effort hasn't gone in vain.
Always humble, Sai. That's how you are. It's not been decent. It has been phenomenal, I would say. The reception has been, it's in the top 10 really, as far as political books are concerned. I think it's number 6 now, so which is fantastic. It's not just a small start and a decent start, but it's doing exceedingly well. But as far as your high standards are concerned, better than expected, or you're too early to comment?
So my first area of concern was the reception from the academic fraternity. So I decided to share the manuscript with people I respect, as opposed to people who are well known in the public domain, because the idea was to send it to people who study and teach the subject on a regular basis, who do this as a matter of profession. So one of the first people that I sent it to was, of course, Dr. Vikram Sampath, whose book on Savarkar has just come out. And his feedback was really helpful, and it really boosted my confidence. But the other person that I sent it out to was Professor Walter D. Mignolo, who is the fount of decolonial scholarship in the world, and who is basically an Argentinian linguistics specialist and someone who understands decolonial studies really well. In fact, if at all there is a history of this particular subject, he'd rank number 2 in the history of the subject. And when I sent him the book, he was kind enough to respond, because I never expected a response from him. I thought, why would he respond to someone writing from India? And he responded, and he exchanged about 15 to 20 mails, giving me feedback on several chapters, explaining where he agreed and where he disagreed also. Then he gave me an opportunity to explain my position. And then he understood where I was coming from. So this gave me the confidence that at the very least, I wouldn't cut a sorry figure before an audience of experts who know the subject. Then in terms of the commercial success of the book, I was at least confident that those who have been listening to my talks and lectures would be interested in reading what I have to say. Because assume for a moment that I have delivered, I think, about 300 lectures so far since 2016. And each of these lectures have covered different aspects of Indian history, Indian philosophy, constitution, so on and so forth. This book is like a coherent framework, a way of looking at things. And I thought, as opposed to telling people facts about different issues, why not give them, let's say, an instrument to look at certain issues? It's like, as opposed to giving someone money by way of a contribution, you give him a job, you give him a certain profession. So that's what I tried to do through this particular book. And I was at the very least confident that if I have X number of people who follow my work on, let's say, all the 4 social media platforms to put together, even if 25% of all those people actually buy the book, it would still rank as a bestseller in this particular category, was my calculation. So I have about 160,000 followers on Twitter and about 30 to 40,000 followers on Facebook and other places, all these put together. And I said, assuming that the rough figure is only 150,000 across the board, 25% of that would still translate to a decent figure. So I asked the publisher what would count as a bestseller in this particular realm. He said, typically for these books, given the serious nature of the subject, if you sell even 10,000 to 20,000, it is seen as a bestseller. I am happy to inform your viewers that they have sold out about 15 to 20,000 copies in the first run before the end of the month. And they're very confident that this figure will only increase as it goes by, because word of mouth seems to be spreading. And people have been very, very kind enough to share pictures, put out hashtags, give out quotes from the book on their own on Twitter, converted this into the form of a thread. So the audience has decided to own the book, which I think is the reflection of the kind of hunger there exists on this subject. And that's one of the reasons I believe that Bharata First is going to do even more better, for the simple reason that the kind of content that you're putting out, I think there's a huge audience waiting to consume it. So as you said, congratulations on the number of subscribers that you have. And I think it's a matter of, I don't think it's a matter of coincidence that initiatives such as your channel and stuff like my book are coming out. Something is happening. And this is, I think, beyond the realm of rationality, according to me, because these are independent ventures that are coming out on their own.
It's our time.
Maybe so.
Well, yeah, well, it's inexplicable, I guess, and it's something that is beyond what we can fathom and what we can think about is happening. And
Correct.
Bharata and the true spirit of Bharata is being taken forward subconsciously and without even us putting an effort. It's happening effortlessly and easily, which is great, and it's fantastic, and a feather in your cap and as well as mine. So pat on each other's back. So you spoke about how you shared the initial copies of the book with academics, and also you spoke about how the book deals with certain aspects. So do you need to have some level of understanding or some level of research in order to read this book? Because that has been one of the points that has always been raised at several of your talks as well, that when Sai Deepak talks, sometimes it goes overboard, becomes difficult for us to understand. So do you need a certain bent of mind or a little bit of knowledge to understand and read the book? And for what readers is it made?
Right. So what I've tried to do is to assimilate the feedback that my talks have received. And I've tried my best to not make those mistakes in the book, which is to say, I tried to put myself in the shoes of a layperson who at the very least has an interest in the issues that surround him, where he suddenly realizes that har cheez pe samvidhan ka issue ud jata hai. Okay. Whenever you talk of temples, there's an issue of constitution. Whenever you speak of secularism, there's an issue of the constitution. When you speak of CA, there's an issue of the constitution. When you speak of Article 370, there's an issue of the constitution. So what is this creature and how are we supposed to understand it? So such a person who has paid attention to this common thread of constitution running through each of these issues, I'm trying to reach out to that particular person, even if he is not legally trained. Okay. The book, according to me, caters to 3 basic kinds of audience at the very least. People who are interested in history, people who are interested in political science, and people who are interested in the law. So it's a confluence of all 3. But I've tried to keep the language, despite my training as a lawyer, as lucid as possible without making too academic, because the idea was to, at the very least, hook the audience into the narrative. So I adopted a relatively new trend, which is that previously introductions of a book would be short. They wouldn't be too long. In this case, the introduction itself is close to about 4,000 words. Okay. And I made the introduction semi-autobiographical, okay, wherein I pulled them into my own journey as to why did I make the switch from engineering to the law? And from someone who was primarily known for intellectual property law and competition law, how am I suddenly dealing with constitutional matters? Okay. And that too, constitutional matters of civilizational importance, because you see, any number of days, I get emails and calls and messages from people asking, we want to do something similar to what you're doing in our own respective areas. And most of them are engineers, by the way. Okay. So how do we make the transition? What are we supposed to do? So I've always told them it's not possible for me to tell you what you should be doing. It's a question that you should ask yourself as to what you're good at and which profession or stream is best suited for your talents and your aptitude and your bandwidth, so to speak. So through this book, I have certainly tried to address some of those questions. And I've also used that as the medium of introducing people to the actual message and the subject of the book, so that from the person they move to the subject gradually. And the best part is, today in the morning, I received at least 2 messages, both on Twitter and elsewhere, saying, this is exactly why I think this book will be read even more, because there's a personal touch to it. It's not an impersonal exposition of the subject, which is complicated. And I'm trying to make it very, very human and personal, because I'm telling them, what are the questions that occurred to me? Why did those questions occur to me? And what is it that I did to address those questions? So the idea is to tell people it is possible to answer each of these questions with a bit more of reading, as opposed to focusing on WhatsApp University. Just try and read the primary source a bit more. And at a time when our attention spans are all falling and we're looking at 5-minute reads and 7-minute reads, the book is an attempt to ask people to go back to the basics also, to read a bit more from the primary source, as opposed to consuming everything from the media, because I don't think the media is the best source of information or news today. At best, there is a news cycle that keeps you constantly active and hyperactive, but I don't think it helps you analyze. I don't think it helps you think. So this book tries to do each of those things. So that's where it is.
I think that's a very valid point that you've made. You know, the newspapers just tell you what's happening, but it does not help you be analytical about any particular subject. You don't really gain knowledge out of newspapers. You just get to know what is happening and
Correct.
a superficial understanding of what a particular issue really is. And
Correct.
yeah, you'll have to basically go beyond the newspapers if you have to understand a subject thoroughly. Now, you spoke about the Constitution. So let's
Right.
focus on that a little bit, you know, because Constitution as a subject, generally,
Right.
you know, for those who do not understand it, it feels like, you know, a behemoth or a giant standing in front of you, your Mount Everest, basically.
Correct. Correct.
And it is considered as a subject that is tough and boring. How
Right.
did you go about dealing with this subject in the book so as to let viewers or readers understand it a little better?
Right. So the title of the book is a reflection of the structure of the book itself. So the subtitle is Coloniality, Civilization, and Constitution. So the good news for non-lawyers is that the Constitution is only 1/3 of the book. Okay, strictly speaking. And out of the 11,
but only 2 chapters dedicated
exactly,
to the
that's what I was
Constitution.
coming to. That's what I was coming to. So out of the 11 chapters, 5 chapters deal with the history of colonialism and the thought process behind it. 4 chapters deal with India's tryst with colonialism in a very specific fashion. In fact, in chapters 8 and 9, I start with the period of 1600, 31st of December 1600, when the British East India Company was first formed. And I go to the period of 1853 in the 9th chapter. The 10th and the 11th chapters is where I start discussing the movement towards the Constitution, saying our contemporary understanding of constitutionalism as a concept. What are its origins? Where did it come from? And what I've tried to do is that I've tried to connect historical milestones with the movement towards the Constitution. Okay. So assume for a moment that you're a huge history buff who wants to understand what happened around the period of the World War, First World War. Okay. And did it have a bearing on the way we are currently situated as nation states, the way we have shaped ourselves and with the institutions that we currently have? So strictly speaking, even the discussion on the Constitution, which is less than 30% of the book, is a discussion on the First World War, is a discussion on the formation of the League of Nations, is a discussion on the independence home rule movement, and then about, let's say, 20% of that talks of the Constitution. Now, just to inform your readers, since this is book 1 of the Bharat trilogy, I'm not discussing the current constitution in the book, which is the Constitution of 1950. I am limiting the period of the book to the period of 1919-1920, because the first British-made constitution for Bharat, which is the Government of India Act of 1919, came into existence then. It came into force then. So, which was followed by the 1935 Government of India Act, which was the second constitution. And then you had the 1950 constitution. So in this book, I limit myself to 1919. The second book will deal with the period from 1920 to 1951, which is where I'll actually have a discussion with respect to the current constitution. And the third book will deal with the period from 1952 and at least until mid-90s, 1952, because that's when we had our first general elections. So that's how I have split it. So in a lot of ways, this book is the foundation for the actual book, which will come later. So this book gives out the conceptual foundations. So it will help you understand, okay, so how am I supposed to understand this creature? What is this a product of? What are the international developments of which this is a child or an offspring, so to speak? Okay, so 1492 to 1919 is the longest span that this book covers, starting from the age of discovery, when Christopher Columbus set out on his voyage. He was searching for India, ultimately went to America, ended up calling it East Indies and all that. So from that to 1919 is what I deal with. And most importantly, the message that I'm trying to convey through the book is the Constitution is not a legal document. It is a socio-political-legal document. So therefore, you cannot and should not try to understand any constitution of any country independent of its history, independent of the socio-political experiences it has been through. Okay. So therefore, the book is like a telescope. The broadest lens is the lens of European colonization. The middle lens is India's experience with colonization. Constitution is the last lens and the smallest lens, which is a product of each of these developments. So typically, when we look at the Constitution, since you and I have been part of several panel discussions, we look at the Constant Assembly debates, we look at reports, we talk of Ambedkar, we talk of Nehru. But I'm saying you have to go back in time, at the very least to 1700s and 1800s, to understand what are the institutions we have inherited as a product of colonization, as a consequence of colonization.
So that is constitution. So let's talk about civilization now.
Right.
And just clear a doubt of mine, because you said the furthest back you've gone is about the 15th century and not beyond that. But when you look at Indian civilization, it's at least a few thousand years old.
Correct.
So how do you deal with this second section of civilization, especially when you have a chapter called Bharat as a civilization?
Correct. So what I've done is, I have tried to explain in those 4 chapters two aspects. One, that if you want to understand Bharat's history, then you have to ask yourself, when was it called Bharat? And what does the name signify? So applying the literature of Latin American scholarship on decoloniality and all that, I've said that a country's indigeneity or nativity, a cutoff period is typically decided based on how it existed on its own, independent of invaders and colonizers. Okay. So I've used Dr. Ambedkar and others to basically say, we existed as who we were until the 8th century Arab Islamic invasions of Sindh. Okay. Which started from 712 AD or 711 Common Era, not AD anymore, from 711. From then onwards until 1600, when the European first entered this country. Okay. And from 1600 to 1947 is the next wave that we're looking at. So what I've done is to say, literature clearly says that we have existed for such a long period, to the extent that the concept of Britishness itself was not alive when we existed as an advanced civilization. So I've covered those aspects, citing the scholars of the mid 20th century or early 20th century, citing them extensively, saying we have had a very clear civilizational awareness, including of how old we are and what our identity is and where we come from. But that particular position has only worsened significantly after the entry of the colonizer, because you have lost a sense of self. You have lost a sense of civilizational consciousness. You have lost a sense of identity. Now, is this because the colonizer did something consciously, or was it because of your own fault? So what I've said is, he also did a few things to actively cut you from your roots, to sever you from your roots. but you too have contributed to that by accepting what he was giving completely. So it's a two-way street, which is to say, if a house gets robbed and you have not locked that particular house, then the thief can be blamed for, let's say, 50% of the crime. The rest of the 50% should be at the doors of the person who was stupid enough to actually leave his house unlocked, okay, or who did not resist that particular entry. So I am basically saying that who we are today, you can't blame it entirely at the Britisher or let's say at the foreigner. You should equally blame yourself for continuing with those traditions and policies even after he has left, because it makes very little sense to blame the foreigner after 1947. You have been an independent country and society. What have you done to free your mind of this mental slavery, of this colonized mentality? If you have done very little, then the problem is to be traceable to your mentality, and the issue is something that you must be held responsible for. This is where I have addressed. Now, one clarification that I must give here is the portion or the section which deals with civilization is not just about history. I'm not throwing random facts of how old we are, what we do, and all that. I am basically saying, when we say Bharat is the successor state to the Indic civilization, to the Bharatiya civilization, why do we use civilization with reference to Bharat? Okay, what makes us a civilization? What are the ingredients of a civilization? Why are we not calling ourselves a nation? What is the difference between a nation and a civilization? What is the difference between a nation state and a civilization state? Is Bharat a civilization state? This is what I'm primarily trying to address. And for all the history buffs, what I've done is I've given extensive references to actual literature, which they can go back and read. So mine is more a discussion on why should we be treated as a civilization? What are the ingredients for it? That is the nature of the discussion.
Clear. And also you're basically looking at civilization more from an aspect of, colonial point of view and taking it forward from there. Correct. And you also spoke about history. So there's no history between 1947 and 2000. Somehow our books, our scholars and everyone seem to have left it out between 1940. And how are we going to learn in this century if we don't know what has happened in the previous 50 years?
Correct.
So
correct.
Great. It gives me an opportunity to start doing something about 1947 to 2000 and also looking at invasions before colonization, because that is something that needs to be looked at as well. And that's something that I'm going to take forward. And thank you for leaving some scope for me. Right. So let's look at coloniality then and how you're addressing this, because we've looked at constitution, we have looked at civilization. Let's look at this aspect too.
Right. So chapter 1 in this regard is extremely important, because it's more like a dictionary in the sense people use the word colonialism. We also use the word colonization. Then how is it different from coloniality is what I've tried to address. So I'm basically saying that colonization is the process of setting up a colony. Colonialism is the policy of setting up colonies. And coloniality is the psychology behind colonialism, is the mentality behind colonialism. What is the fount of thought? Why would you decide to set up a colony? You would decide to set up a colony if you believe that you have the natural or the divine right to rule others, or if you believe that you have the natural and divine right to own and expropriate their resources, if you believe that there are lesser people compared to you. And why do you believe that there are lesser people? Is it because of their religion? Is it because of their race? Is it because of the skin color? Is it the complexion that you believe that because you're white and we are brown, you're superior and we are inferior? So these are aspects that I try to unpack in the first section, section 1. But chapter 1 specifically, I discuss these words because I believe that language is extremely important. Okay. And I have tried to basically connect how coloniality has given birth to what we call modernity or modern. Okay, so we keep using the word modern in such loose terms in our daily conversations: modern India, modern society, modern science, so on and so forth, modern education. What do we mean by modern? Who introduced modernity? What is the timeline it can be traced to? Is there a colonial assumption behind it? If somebody is modern, who is anti-modern? Who is traditional? This is one aspect that I've significantly dealt with. The second thing that I've done is I have discussed the experience of Africa, North America, Latin America, the Caribbean with colonization, and basically said, this has been their experience. They have been completely wiped out, or they've been asked to give up the faith of their ancestors. Okay. So when it comes to Bharat, why do we believe that the very same person, when he enters Bharat, he had very different, let's say, intentions, or his notions were very different? Because whenever we look at, let's say, the history of colonization or the experience of colonization, we see it primarily as a commercial venture. We see it primarily as a bunch of traders, greedy traders who come here, who start trading, and then they decide to rule us. I said that's such a simplistic way of looking at it, because they started on this voyage to rule the rest of the world, not because of commerce, but because they had a very specific belief system, they had a very specific value system. And as long as you don't address that particular issue, you're constantly beating around the bush, because you'll continuously speak of only the economic loss that you've suffered as a consequence of colonization, not the cultural loss, not the civilizational loss. Your originality has been completely taken away from you, which is the biggest loss that you can suffer as an individual or a society. Okay, so that is what I'm trying to address in the first section.
Absolutely. So when you wrote this book, Sai, and when you got through got through your day's work, what was the most challenging aspect, and the most interesting aspect about this book?
In general, the most exhilarating and frustrating thing about writing is that your mind is exploding with ideas. Okay. See, it's like this. It's like a situation where you have too many things to choose from and you don't know what to choose. Okay. When you have tons of ideas and you have to realize that you have to make this book readable, you have to make this book lucid, you have to ensure that you don't lose the audience in the process of making it all encompassing. So the choice is this. If you have 25 bullets, you fire 25 bullets in all directions and it makes no impact. Okay. Or you choose only 5 bullets and fire it in the right direction so that it hits the target. Okay. So in this case, I had so many bullets, I decided that I'd be wasting my energies and the book would lack a serious flow if I don't focus on specific issues and connect each of those dots. So that's one frustrating aspect that I had to overcome. The second thing is, when you write a book, and I'm sure that every person's experience is different. My own experience was that it's a constant track at the back of your mind. No matter what you do throughout the day, as long as you're awake, in fact, sometimes even when you're asleep, you're constantly thinking of, how do I get this right? Because you see, the biggest fear that you have is, what if some of your best ideas come after the book is published? Then it's out. There's nothing that you can do, right? It's not a social media post with an edit option. Okay, once the book is out, then effectively people have the opportunity to say, you completely screwed up on these aspects. Even despite the best efforts, that's always going to happen, because there'll be critiques, there'll be people who appreciate it. That can't be changed. But at least to your own satisfaction and to your own confidence, you have to come out with a good product. Okay. So I put myself in the shoes of an innovator who's coming out with a product. Okay. So that journey is something that I've enjoyed, but you need a break after that journey. So which is why my second book, I will take some time before I recharge my batteries. I'm not going to start the process immediately. The good news is that the research is complete for for the third book as well. The material is ready. But putting it together in the form of a book, and because that's the actual object of my efforts as opposed to the first book, I will start it perhaps in 2 or 3 months. Now, for me, it's like a Kit Kat break. I need something sweet. I need something light.
One book a year is very good pace, I would say. So even if you take a good break of 3 or 4 months, I think the next one can be out by the end of maybe 2022 or mid of 2022, which isn't too bad at all. One book a year for someone who's got such a successful career as a lawyer too is more than enough and more than good enough. So also, Sai, before I let you go, let's talk about the international launch and how it has been received internationally as well, because that's something that you're looking forward to too.
Right. So the good part is most of my talks and lectures, fortunately, have had a decent and okay, dare I say, a fantastic reception in other parts of the world as well. Especially in North America and in Europe, I've had a very good, let's say, bunch of people who wait for the next video of the lecture. So once the book came out, one of the things that I had already asked the publisher was, be ready for an avalanche of requests from these jurisdictions. You're going to get it. So he said, we'll certainly do it, and we'll release Kindle versions first. I said the Kindle version is one thing, but most people would want to have the book in their hands because the feel is always different when you actually have the hard copy. And they would want to appreciate the cover, which is the product of a brilliant team. And these are things that you can't substitute with a Kindle version. There is, I mean, Kindle is Kindle, there's no doubt, but a book is still a book. So as soon as the book came out from Japan, Europe, United Kingdom, Australia, and North America, the publisher started receiving so many requests that now they have decided to release the book physically in stores in each of these continents, in each of these countries. So as opposed to simply shipping it out from Bharat, the books will be available. And since Bloomsbury has a fantastic presence in both Europe as well as in the United States, and Bloomsbury being the publisher, they have decided to go ahead with it. And the Kindle version's success has given them the confidence that the hard copy will do equally good. In the Constitution category in the United States, the book is in the top 10 in the Kindle version, and which for an Indian book, for someone who is not known as an author, I think I'm very happy that this has got the kind of reception it has. And my intention itself is that this should form a part of libraries across universities, where they discuss decolonial studies, where they discuss colonization, and where they discuss constitution. In each of those departments, at the very least, this must serve as one of the reference books as far as Bharat is concerned. That has been one of my motivations when I wrote that. I don't know if this is too ambitious, but I decided to at least set an ambitious target for me so that I read somewhere. So this has been my goal.
Wonderful hearing this, and I wish you all the success, and I wish the book all the success as well, and may it be the #1 bestseller really soon, and may it stay on the top spot for as many months and maybe even a year if it can, and till the next one comes out. Till the next one comes out, let it be there on the top spot. And may Bharata also rise and shine and always be first, and like it was in those good old glorious days before the invasions. Sai Deepak, a pleasure as always conversing with you and having you here on Bharata First. All the very best to you.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you. Thanks a lot for your blessings, for your wishes and your prayers. Thanks a lot. Namaste.
Namaste. And once again, before I go, let me remind you to like the video, subscribe, hit the bell icon, and share the video. Do subscribe to our newsletter to get some incisive content. The Bharata First team runs several quizzes. You can participate in them. If you like our content, please contribute to keep it alive. Let me also take this opportunity to inform you about Bharata First Knowledge Center, an initiative that will help each one of you in your competitive exams and transform the way you learn. Go to kc.bharatafirst.com for more details and register now. Experience a whole new way of gaining knowledge. All this information, along with some must-see recommendations, are in the description of the video. Please go through it. That's it from me. See you again next time.